Welcome to the Feathered Report, where the guys from Upduck discuss the latest news from the worlds of upland and waterfowl.
All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Feathered Report. Jeff here this week. I think this is our third or fourth Feathered Report. So we're hoping to kind of ramp these things up as we go here. As more and more news starts to trickle in, we'll hopefully get on here and get some good episodes out for you guys. Again, these are just short little episodes, 5 to 10 minutes, just kind of reporting on some of the latest and greatest things that have come up in our world, whether it's waterfowl or upland or dogs, or anything in between there. So today, there's a couple topics that I'm going to talk about. One of them is just kind of circling back to our previous podcast episode, where we talked about whether or not waterfowl and upland hunting is harder now than it was 50 years ago. So a lot of interesting things came up in that. That was a really fun episode. That was with me, Matt, and Tyler. So if you haven't listened to that, I would suggest going and checking it out. But this is just kind of a little add-on to that episode. So I had a conversation with a friend after he listened to the podcast, and he brought up some interesting points that we didn't talk about, we didn't touch on. When we were talking about low bird numbers, especially for upland birds. In this particular instance, he was talking about pheasants. This particular friend lives in central Iowa. So the majority of the wild birds in terms of upland birds that are around him are pheasants. And one of the things that he mentioned was trapping, and how predation, is one of the things that also comes to mind. And upland birds, are no stranger to predation. That's one of the many reasons why us here in southeastern Wisconsin, have a hard time maintaining a wild bird population. One of the many things, but predation is definitely one of those issues. Pheasants, for example, often preyed upon by coyotes, foxes, raccoons, skunks. And when you think of like raccoons and skunks, majority of that is, raiding nests and eating the pheasant eggs. So I did a little research on this. It was kind of interesting, and I'd like to kind of get your guys' feedback too on this as well. When we talk about trapping, he talked about how it seems like there's less and less people trapping now than there was back in the 80s or the 90s. So I was curious, and I went in and did a little bit of research. It looks like back in the early 80s, fur prices were up pretty high, and there was a lot of demand, especially for beaver pelts. But fur prices were up, and we had a really significant amount of people that were going out and trapping. Obviously, beavers aren't really an issue, but if you're trapping beavers, you're probably trapping other things as well, right? So, and then came the 90s. The 90s is when you had, PETA started getting involved. You had a lot of these anti-trapping movements happening, where a lot of people were frowning upon this practice or this sport, if you will. So my friend, again, who lives in central Iowa, he was talking about how he noticed there was a big increase in coyote numbers. Versus back then, 30 years ago, possibly, and how animals like the jackrabbit, are few and far between compared to a few decades ago, where you used to see them all over the place. So the good news is that as I was doing some reading on the trapping numbers, it looks like they are actually starting to go back up, which is great. I've read that a lot of, like our hunter education programs are now starting to include trapping in their lessons, and they're getting more and more kids involved, more and more adult onset hunters, and so on and so forth are starting to take up trapping again. So I also read that COVID helped in that as well. Where a lot of people were looking for new activities. They were looking for ways to get outdoors, taking up hunting, taking up trapping. And a lot of people realized how fun trapping can be. And that just kind of stuck. So good news there, that the trapping numbers seem like they're starting to go up. They're definitely not the way they were. back in the 80s, it doesn't sound like, but hopefully that'll continue to increase here. And who knows, maybe that should help some of our wild bird populations across these different states. All right. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about tonight is about a bill that was introduced in Kansas. It sounded like this bill was going to be, a sure thing. It was going to go through, no issue. And then the governor of Kansas vetoed it. And it sounds like that veto stuck. So this bill was introduced to restrict non-resident hunters to only hunt 3 days per week, which is very interesting. I haven't seen anything like this. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist in other states, but the 3 days per week thing seemed kind of odd just out the get-go. So they were proposing that non-resident hunters can only hunt Sundays, Mondays, and Tuesdays. And that does not apply to private land, doesn't apply to walk-in access lands, or the 3 main navigable waters or navigable rivers in Kansas, which would be the Kansas River, the Missouri River, and the Arkansas River. So the biggest concern is that there are some areas in the state where it's starting to flip, where there's more non-resident hunters in these areas than there are resident. And some of these 2 areas that they were talking about are, I think it's pronounced Cheyenne Bottoms and Neosho Wetlands. So these are just a couple of the areas that were mentioned. I'm sure there's lots of other areas around the state of Kansas, but those were the 2 that were most concerning. So I started looking at the numbers in Kansas as well for resident waterfowl hunters versus non-resident waterfowl hunters, and it is pretty staggering to look at. The stats that I see started in 2006, and you had the percentage of non-resident hunters at that time, which to me, that's not that long ago, was 19.3% for non-resident and 80.7% for resident. All right. Now you have, fast forward to 2024, we're all the way up. So from 19.3% in 2006, now in 2024, the percentage of non-residents is 41.39%. And the percentage of resident hunters is 51.6. Now that's crazy to me, that you have almost just as many non-resident hunters as you have resident hunters. And I think that was one of the main concerns, that the resident waterfowlers were saying that they're not getting the same opportunities that they used to because you have all these non-resident people pouring into their areas. And I say their areas in quotations. There's a lot to be discussed here, right? So this is a tough one. I definitely see both sides of it. The first question that comes to mind, I guess, is why are all these non-residents crossing the borders into Kansas instead of hunting their own states? Are there more birds? Is there more access? Is there better habitat? And that's something I would have to learn a little bit more about. Kansas borders Missouri, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Colorado. Now, these are pretty good states for duck hunting. Missouri and Oklahoma, definitely, and Nebraska and Colorado as well. So I guess I don't quite understand why all these people are flooding into Kansas. Most likely, probably the majority of them from these neighboring states. Neosho Wetlands, I saw that one is right by the border of Missouri. So I would assume, you have a lot of Missouri residents that live near the border that are crossing over. But why aren't they hunting their own state? Or maybe they are. Are bird numbers that much better just a few miles west? Or, is there a lack of access on the Missouri side in that area? Is there not as many public lands, not as many walk-in areas, so on and so forth? And then you have that Cheyenne Bottoms. Now, that one is dead center in the state. It's a huge area that sounds like is very popular. One of the destination spots in Kansas, if you will, for waterfowl hunting. And unlike Neosho, I would assume that most non-residents that come there to hunt are doing so for multiple days, right? It's right dead center in the state, a little bit harder to get to for just a day trip or something like that. So if they're staying for multiple days, right? I mean, this means that they're staying in hotels, they're staying in Airbnbs, and they're eating at local restaurants. They're spending a lot of money on local businesses in that area. So it has to be some good in this too, right? And then I started looking at the cost of non-resident hunting licenses. So looks like they're about $125 somewhere in that ballpark. And for 2024, the 2023-2024 season, there were 17,298 licenses sold for non-residents. That's over $2 million in just licenses alone for the state. That's a lot of money. On the flip side, though, like, I'm a waterfowler. I fully understand why resident waterfowlers would be upset about this. I would be pissed off too. It's easy for an outsider to sit here and say, what about all the money that's pouring into the state? What about all this? What about all that? However, if I pulled up to my spot, got out there at 4 a.m, 5 a.m, whatever it may be, and I pull into the parking lot and see nothing but out-of-state license plates, I would be pretty pissed off as well. So I definitely see that side of things. Don't get me wrong here. I'm just trying to play devil's advocate a little bit when it comes to maybe some of the reasons why somebody would see the other side of this, right? So it sounds like the vetoing really came down to the economic impact that these areas in the state would see if the non-residents just stopped coming. You're talking about millions and millions of dollars leaving the state possibly, which can help conservation efforts, improve access, improve habitat, all of that stuff that we like to see. And then I was kind of thinking about, okay, well, what other options could there be? There has to be some other viable options here. Could you just increase the cost of the non-resident licenses? I would assume you'll lose a certain percentage of non-residents if the prices went up enough. You're not going to lose them all, but you would lose some, I would assume. Especially maybe those guys that are just hopping across the border here and there because it's cheap to do so. I would assume that increase in price could probably offset the loss in hunters as well. So maybe you're not necessarily losing money in the long run, but you are having a little bit lower of a percentage of hunters that are non-residents show up. That was just the first thing that came to my mind. I'm sure there's a lot more moving parts to this. So aside from the economic impact, another thing I think we have to remember too is that, our overall goal, as hunters and conservationists should be to increase opportunities across our country, right? Regardless of the state that you live in. For the residents that are complaining, have they ever taken an out-of-state hunting trip? How would they feel if they got absolutely gouged in license fees, or they were only restricted to hunt on Sundays, Mondays, and Tuesdays? It basically made it almost impossible for them to take out-of-state trips easily, right? Would you be upset if that happened to you, right? If you were a Kansas resident, maybe you wanted to go to Oklahoma or Missouri or any of those other states. I'm sure they wouldn't be too thrilled if that were the case in those other states as well. So yeah, there's a lot to think about, a lot to digest here. Again, I definitely see both sides of it. If this was happening in our state consistently, I'm sure I would be upset as well and be looking for solutions. The whole 3-day restriction thing, I don't know if that's the best resolution, in my opinion. But I'd be curious to hear what your guys' thoughts are on that. And hopefully they can come up with something that'll make both sides happy, right? So yeah, I think that's about it for this episode. Again, these are just quick little episodes here. Get you guys some news. Hopefully we can get some feedback from these. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on either of these topics. Let me know what you think, what side of the fence you're on. All right. Well, thanks for tuning in, everybody. And we will catch you on the next episode of the Feathered Report.